There are very few wineries in the world that have got contiguous collection of old wine going back to the 19th century. And it just absolutely blew me away that a winery could have the vision to put down a barrel for 100 years and the opportunity for a generation or 2 or 3 generations in the future to taste the fruits of 19th century labour. Absolutely amazing that Seppeltsfield is a really, really special place. And in many respects, it defines the story of the Barossa Valley and its ambitions for the future, because the Seppelts were extraordinary people with extraordinary hopes and aspirations. You are listening to Andrew Caillard, and this podcast is a story about Seppeltsfield, one of the greatest wineries of the Barossa Valley. South Australia was established in 1836, and soon after, one of the pioneers of the region, Colonel William Light, who was the Surveyor General of South Australia, took a party northwards of Adelaide to seek agricultural land for future pioneers. And after some days, he arrived in this beautiful wooded area, which he named the Lindock Valley and the Barossa Ranges. And today, this region is known as the Barossa, or more commonly known as the Barossa Valley. The first settlers into this region were English pioneers. But soon after, the region attracted a whole community of Silesian immigrants who were escaping persecution from what is now Eastern Europe. And this community was financed by William Angus, who was a visionary pioneer for South Australia. And they called this place New Silesia. Joseph Seppelt was very different from all the other Silesian settlers who had established small farms in the Barossa Valley. He arrived with his family from Silesia, from the same place, but unlike many of the other settlers, he was very wealthy. He had been a tobacco merchant in Silesia, and he had a lot of capital behind him. And so he was able to buy a lot of land, and he was able to invest in buildings, vineyards, and was able to establish a going concern very early on. But what happened was when he planted tobacco, he found that the climate really wasn't suited to tobacco. So he looked for other crops that were more suitable for the warm, dry climate that the Barossa Valley was known for. And so he moved towards planting vines and starting to make wine. And I think that what is so interesting about the Seppeltsfield story is that it absolutely defines the zeitgeist of the times of the mid-19th century, from the sailing age to the steam age, and industrialization, organization, better social standards, and also better hygiene. Joseph Seppelt and his son Benno Seppelt built this Seppeltsfield winery complex, or a remarkable model of 19th century ambition, which was all about a kind of post-revolutionary philosophy of agriculture, in which if you created a place like this, it would generate an economy. When you look at the buildings around today, and you look at the history of modern winemaking, it is a remarkable thing. And it's very reflective of the ideas of winemaking around the world. Winemaking was very much a cottage industry until around the 1850s, 1860s. And this is the point about Seppeltsfield. And when you're talking about industrialization and fine wine, the two words don't mix very well. But the truth is that modern wine is an industrialized product, in the sense that to be able to create a wine business that is effective, you have to make wine with scale. It wasn't really until the second generation with Benno Seppelt. He was well known for his polish, and he was a very, very smart, intelligent man with this incredible ambition to build what his father had built before him. But of course, he had more resources because technology had improved. He really did take Seppeltsfield from a moderate-sized winery into the largest winery in the world. It had over 1 million gallons of wine in its storage in 1900. And it exported a lot of its wine, and it wasn't only fortified wine, which it has become best known for in more recent times, but it also exported a lot of table wine into the British Commonwealth and established itself as this extraordinary piece of modern winemaking. It wasn't really until the 1860s that machine-made bottles were invented. And that, of course, meant that you could run things down a bottling line, but also it meant that when the wines had already been made, rather than sending the wines by cask all the way to Europe or elsewhere, you could export in bottles, and also because of the steamships, you could expect to get the wines safely to their destination very, very quickly. Fast forwarding today, when I think of Warren Randall, he's almost like a Seppelt. The same energy, the same belief that in the future, the same extraordinary risk-taking that the Seppelts did in building something into something really special. So when I look at Seppeltsfield today and look at the way that they have developed the place, it is quite extraordinary. And one of the centerpieces of Seppeltsfield is the 1888 Gravity Flow Winery, which was absolutely at the cutting edge of winemaking technology at the time. Gravity Flow built up against a hill. And that Gravity Flow winery has been renovated, it's been steel lined, and it is now fully in operation again. That is a fragment of a 19th century ambition that is continuing because of the belief of Warren Randall that he can redefine the Seppeltsfield name in modern times. In 1878, after Joseph Seppelt died, Benno Seppelt decided that he would put down a cask of tawny port and said to everybody, these casks are not to be bottled for another 100 years. And so the 1878, it was topped up fairly regularly because the evaporation rate over 100 years is quite a lot. So the original cask gets smaller and smaller and smaller as they're topping up with the same vintage. Over a period of time, these vintage tawnies become more and more concentrated and thicker and gluggier like treacle. But they still have this freshness because of the brandy spirit, and then they're bottled 100 years later and we get to enjoy them. The Seppelt family had this incredible vision, not only for themselves, but for their community. And so when the region found itself in recession, they also employed labourers to plant over 1,000 date palm trees down the avenues around Seppeltsfield, of which they all stand today, and also doing other work around the place. Because the Seppelt family really did believe that there was a massive future for Australia. That is what makes Seppeltsfield such an important part of Australia's fine wine narrative. One of the cornerstones of the Seppeltsfield story is the wonderful Seppeltsfield Para Liqueur Tawnies, which were first released in 1978. But they have a history that goes back to the 19th century, because Benno Seppelt, when his dad died, decided to honour him by putting down a cask of vintage tawny every year, but not to be bottled for 100 years after it had been laid down. And when you actually consider the whole turmoil of the Australian wine industry and the changes of ownership from family companies to corporate companies, and sometimes in the case of Seppeltsfield, from family to corporate, from corporate back to family again, there's always a bit of buccaneering and all sorts of kind of things that corporates do, particularly in trying to keep the businesses afloat. And they could, for instance, have sold all of that wine off during the very difficult times of the 80s and 90s, but they didn't. And so this extraordinary legacy still exists. And I remember tasting the 1878 wine for the first time and thinking, what an extraordinary experience. And I think that's one of the great things about this particular wine, which is now it's really is the cornerstone of the Seppeltsfield story, and it is considered as one of the great Australian collectibles, and it's classified by the Langton's auction house in its Langton's classification of Australian wine as exceptional, because it is one of Australia's most important fragments of the 19th century, and it's not only a surviving 19th century fragment, it's a living 19th century fragment. So by 1905, Seppeltsfield was the largest wine business in Australia, with exporting wines to the various states, New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, etc., and also exporting quite a lot of wine overseas as well. It had over 100 million gallons of wine in storage, which is extraordinary. And Joseph Seppelt planted grape varieties that we know today in the Barossa, particularly Mataro, Shiraz and Grenache. And of course, Seppeltsfield is now making some great table wines from these varieties. Benno Seppelt was an extraordinary man, and I think that anyone who would look at the history of South Australia would have to say that he was one of the most remarkable men of his generation. He was described as an inventive genius, and his grasp of detail and prompt and exact business methods were hugely admired by his contemporaries and by other leaders of the state or of the colony. By the late 1800s, Seppeltsfield was regarded as the finest of its kind and approaching the finest growths of Europe. And I think that's one of the points that should be made about Australian wine, and particularly of Australian wine in the 19th century. Today, Australia is renowned for a lot of its volume brands. During the 19th century, Australia had a very, very strong premium edge, and the wines were hugely admired by the commentators of the time for their authenticity, for their richness, for their volume, for their longevity, for their potential as really fine wines. And what I think is so exciting about Seppeltsfield today is the ambition of Seppeltsfield is to bring back that optimism and that belief that the Barossa Valley, which is already doing, a lot of other wineries are doing, but the Barossa Valley generally is one of the great wine regions of the world and can produce some of the greatest wines in the world. For more information on the remarkable history of Seppeltsfield, visit seppeltsfield.com.au. This podcast was read by Andrew Caillard. Sound designed by Declan Diacono at Clang Studios. Music by James Greville. And produced by Christoph Priddle.